The day my PE teacher did something to me in the school bathroom was so unexpected, yet so exciting, that I'll remember it for the rest of my life. It happened 3 weeks ago. The day started like any other at my high school, with the usual mix of monotony and chatter filling the hallways between classes. But even as the hours passed, something about that day felt different. Though I couldn't quite put my finger on it. The air seemed heavier. Or maybe it was just my nerves. PE was my last class of the day. And while I usually enjoyed it, the thought of the gym teacher, Mr. Hubert, filled me with a strange mix of excitement and tension I couldn't quite explain. Mr. Hubert had been at our school for only a year. But in that time he'd become a favorite among students. He was in his late 20s, fit and energetic, with sharp green eyes and a smile that seemed to light up the entire room. He was the kind of teacher who made you want to do your best. Not because he demanded it, but because you didn't want to disappoint him. For me, though, there was something else, a connection I couldn't ignore. Even if it made me feel guilty for thinking about him in ways I knew I shouldn't. When class started, the usual routine of warm-ups and drills quickly gave way to an intense game of dodgeball. I wasn't the most athletic guy in class, but I held my own, dodging and weaving as balls flew past me. My focus was divided, though, as I kept catching glimpses of Mr. Hubert on the sidelines, his whistle hanging loosely around his neck as he shouted encouragement to everyone on the court. "Keep moving. Don't stand still," he called out, his voice carrying easily over the chaos. Every time he shouted my name specifically, I felt a jolt of energy run through me, spurring me to move faster. Jump higher. I wasn't just playing to win. I was playing to impress him. By the end of the game, I was drenched in sweat, my heart pounding from the exertion. Mr. Hubert called for everyone to gather around, giving a quick debrief on what we'd done well and what we could improve. His gaze seemed to linger on me a moment longer than necessary when he spoke. And I felt my cheeks heat up despite the cool air in the gym. "All right, that's it for today," he announced, clapping his hands together. "Hit the showers, and I'll see you all tomorrow." As everyone filed out, I lingered, taking my time to put away the equipment we'd used. I didn't want to admit it to myself, but I was stalling, hoping for an excuse to stay behind. Mr. Hubert noticed, of course. He always did. "Need some help with that, Paul?" he asked, stepping closer. I shook my head quickly. "No, I got it. Just wanted to make sure everything's put back right." I gave him a small smile, the kind that made my stomach flip. "Appreciate the effort. You're always one of the last to leave, aren't you?" I shrugged, suddenly feeling self-conscious under his gaze. "I guess I just like making sure everything's in order." "Well," he said, leaning casually against the wall, "it doesn't go unnoticed. You've got a good work ethic, Paul. It's rare to see." His words made me feel warm inside, a feeling that only deepened when he clapped a hand on my shoulder. A brief, casual gesture that somehow felt more intimate than it should have. I looked up at him, startled by how close he was. And for a moment, neither of us said anything. The silence stretched, heavy and charged, until he finally cleared his throat and stepped back. "You should head to the showers before the hot water runs out," he said, his tone light, but his expression unreadable. I nodded, grabbing my bag and heading toward the school bathroom, my heart pounding in my chest. The air inside was humid, the sharp scent of body wash and sweat hanging in the air. As the other guys finished up and left one by one, I took my time, waiting until the room was empty before stepping into one of the stalls and turning on the water. The heat washed over me, soothing my muscles, but doing nothing to calm the whirlwind of thoughts in my head. Why did I feel like this? Why did every interaction with Mr. Hubert leave me feeling off balance? Like I was teetering on the edge of something I couldn't define? And why, no matter how much I told myself it was wrong, did I want more? I was still lost in thought when I heard the school bathroom door open. My heart jumped, and I froze, straining to hear who it was. Footsteps echoed against the tiled floor, slow and deliberate, and I felt a strange mix of anticipation and dread settle over me. "Paul?" The sound of Mr. Hubert's voice made my breath catch. I turned off the water real quick. He was standing near the sinks, his arms crossed over his chest, a faint frown creasing his brow. "Everything okay?" he asked, his eyes scanning me briefly before meeting my gaze. "Yeah, just lost track of time," I said, my voice sounding shaky, even to my own ears. He nodded, but his expression didn't soften. "You've been pushing yourself hard in class lately," I noticed. I didn't know how to respond to that, so I just stood there, my pulse racing as he took a step closer. "I'm serious, Paul," he continued, his voice lowering slightly. "You're a good kid, and I don't want you overdoing it." The concern in his tone made my chest tighten. And before I could think better of it, the words slipped out. "Why do you care so much?" His eyes widened, and for a moment he seemed caught off guard. But then his expression softened, and he took another step closer. Close enough that I could see the faint stubble on his jaw and the way his Adam's apple bobbed when he swallowed. "Because you're worth caring about," he said quietly. The words hung in the air between us like a challenge. I didn't know what to say to that. My mind was a blur of emotions. Confusion, hope, fear, all tangled together in a knot I couldn't untangle. And then, before I could stop myself, I reached out my hand, brushing against his arm. His arm was warm under the fabric of his polo shirt, soft against my fingertips. I hadn't planned to reach out. It just happened, like my body was acting on instinct before my mind could catch up. For a moment, he froze, his eyes locked on mine, and I saw something flicker across his face that I couldn't quite identify. It wasn't shock, though, or anger. If anything, it was curiosity. "Paul," he said, his voice softer now, almost cautious. I dropped my hand quickly, my face heating up as I stumbled to explain myself. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to." He shook his head, cutting me off. "It's okay." His tone was steady, reassuring, but his eyes remained locked on mine, searching. I just wasn't expecting that. Neither was I. The tension in the air between us was almost tangible now, and I found myself gripping the edge of the sink behind me, trying to steady my breathing. The room felt smaller somehow. The sound of the dripping showerhead in the background, the only noise breaking the silence. "I should go," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. But even as I said it, I didn't move. I couldn't. He took a step closer, and I could feel the heat radiating from him now, the faint scent of his cologne lingering in the humid air. "You don't have to," he said quietly, his eyes softening. "Not if you don't want to." My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst. "Mr. Hubert," Call me Ronald, he interrupted gently, a small smile playing at the corners of his lips. We're not in class. That smile did something to me. Made my chest feel tight in a way I couldn't explain. Ronald. I repeated the name, feeling foreign on my tongue, but strangely right at the same time. He took another step closer, his hand lifting slightly as if he was about to reach for me. But then hesitated. Look, if this is making you uncomfortable. It's not, I blurted out, the words spilling from my mouth before I could stop them. I don't know what this is. He nodded slowly, his gaze never leaving mine. Neither do I, but I know how I feel. Those words hung in the air between us, heavy with meaning. I swallowed hard, my throat dry as I tried to process what he was saying. And how do you feel? I asked, my voice trembling. He took a final step forward, closing the distance between us until we were only inches apart. I could feel the warmth of his breath on my skin, and my entire body felt like it was buzzing with electricity. Like this, he said softly, and then he leaned in. The moment our lips met, it was like the world stopped spinning. His kiss was soft at first, tentative, as if he was giving me the chance to pull away. But when I didn't, when I tilted my head slightly, leaning into him, he deepened the kiss, his hand coming up to cradle the side of my face. I couldn't think, couldn't breathe. All I could do was feel the way his lips moved against mine. The gentle scrape of his stubble against my skin. The strength in his hands as he pulled me closer. It was overwhelming in the best possible way. And I found myself melting into him, my hands gripping his arms to steady myself. When he finally pulled back, his forehead rested lightly against mine, and we were both breathing hard. His eyes searched mine, and I could see the same mixture of emotions reflected in his gaze: uncertainty, longing, fear. I've never done this before, I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. Neither have I, he said, a soft laugh escaping his lips. But I can't stop thinking about you, Paul. I've tried, believe me, but every time I see you. He trailed off, shaking his head as if the words were too much. I didn't know what to say. My mind was spinning, my heart racing, and all I could think about was how much I wanted to kiss him again. So I did. This time, I was the one who leaned in, my hands sliding up to cup his face as our lips met again. This kiss was different, more certain, more intense. His hands found my waist, pulling me flush against him, and I could feel the heat of his body through the towel still wrapped around me. Ronald, I murmured against his lips, the name feeling more natural now. He pulled back just enough to look at me, his thumb brushing against my cheek. We shouldn't be doing this, he said, but there was no conviction in his voice, only hesitation. I don't care, I said, surprising even myself with how sure I sounded. I want this. His expression softened, and he nodded, his lips curling into a small, almost sad smile. Me too. We stood there for what felt like an eternity. The silence between us no longer awkward, but heavy with unspoken promises. I didn't know what would happen next. If this was something we could ever talk about again. If it was a one-time thing. Or if it would change everything between us. But in that moment, none of it mattered. His hands lingered on my waist as we stood there, caught in the moment. The tension in the air between us was thick, making the world outside feel distant and irrelevant. My mind raced with thoughts I couldn't untangle. But one thing was certain. I didn't want this moment to end. But then, all of a sudden, he stepped back, just enough to create a small gap between us. His gaze lingered on mine, his eyes searching for something. Maybe reassurance, or maybe clarity. "Paul," he said softly, his voice tinged with both concern and longing. "We need to talk about this." I nodded, though my chest tightened at the idea of breaking the spell we just created. "Yeah," I said, my voice quieter than I intended. "We should. But you know we aren't even done here." Ronald motioned toward the bench near the lockers, his usual confidence tempered by a vulnerability I'd never seen in him before. He sat down first, running a hand through his short, dark hair, his other hand resting on his knee. I hesitated for a moment before joining him, keeping just enough distance between us to remind myself to breathe. "I'm not sure how to explain this," he began, his voice low, almost hesitant. "What happened just now? It wasn't planned." "I know," I said quickly, not wanting him to think I'd misread his intentions. "It wasn't for me either." He nodded, his shoulders relaxing slightly, though the tension in his expression remained. "But it happened," he continued, turning to face me fully. "And I don't regret it. He paused, searching for the right words. "I need to know what you're thinking." I took a deep breath, trying to organize my thoughts. "I don't regret it either," I admitted, my voice steadier than I expected. "But it's confusing. I've never felt like this about anyone before. Let alone you." His lips twitched into a faint smile that makes two of us. The weight of his words settled over me, and I felt a strange sense of relief knowing I wasn't alone in this. But the reality of the situation loomed over us. Unspoken but undeniable. "What happens now?" I asked, my heart pounding as I waited for his answer. Ronald leaned back slightly, his gaze fixed on the far wall as he considered the question. "I don't know," he admitted finally. Whatever this is, it's complicated." "Yeah," I agreed, my stomach twisting at the thought. "It is. But the story didn't end there. No, the craziest part was yet to come." For a while, we just sat there, the silence between us filled with unspoken thoughts. I could feel the warmth of his presence beside me, the subtle tension in his posture, as if he was trying to hold himself back. And yet there was a tenderness in the way he looked at me, a softness that made my chest ache. "You're graduating soon," he said suddenly, breaking the silence. "You'll be moving on, starting a new chapter. I don't want to do anything that could mess that up for you." The sincerity in his voice caught me off guard, and I turned to face him fully. "You're not messing anything up," I said firmly. "If anything, this feels like the one thing in my life that makes sense right now." He looked at me, his expression unreadable, and for a moment I thought he might argue. But then he sighed, a small, resigned smile playing on his lips. "You always know what to say, don't you?" I shrugged, trying to hide the way my cheeks flushed under his gaze. "Only when it matters." His smile widened, and he reached out his hand, resting lightly on mine. The gesture was simple, but it sent a jolt of warmth through me, grounding me in a way I hadn't realized I needed. "Paul," he said softly, his thumb brushing against my knuckles. "This is new territory for both of us. I don't want to rush into anything, but I also don't want to pretend this didn't happen." "Me neither," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. For a while, we just stood there, our hands entwined, the quiet hum of the school bathroom filling the space around us. It felt like the rest of the world had faded away, leaving only the two of us in this strange, fragile moment. But reality had a way of creeping back in, and eventually Ronald pulled his hand away, his expression sobering. "We should get out of here," he said, his voice tinged with regret. "Before someone comes looking for us." I nodded, my heart sinking at the thought of leaving this moment behind. "Yeah, you're right." We stood there together, the weight of what had just happened still hanging heavy between us as we made our way toward the door. Ronald hesitated, his hand hovering near mine as if he wanted to reach out again, but thought better of it. Instead, he gave me a small, reassuring smile. "This doesn't have to be the end," he said, his voice low but steady. I nodded, clinging to his words like a lifeline. "I don't want it to end," I said, hoping it would be enough to keep the uncertainty at bay. And so we did not leave the school toilet just yet, but still, and I don't know how the air in the small dimly lit school toilet felt heavy, charged with a tension that was impossible to ignore. The quiet hum of the fluorescent light above was the only sound breaking the silence save for the faint rhythm of our breathing. We hadn't moved much from where we stood, facing each other close enough that I could feel the faint warmth radiating from him. Ronald's gaze was locked on mine, his expression a mix of determination and restraint. "Paul," he said softly, his voice low and steady. "We don't have to do this. Not here, not now." But I could see it in his eyes. The same pull I was feeling. The same silent plea for more. My pulse quickened, and I shook my head slightly, taking a step closer until the space between us was near non-existent. "I want to," I said, my voice quiet but firm. "I don't want to stop." For a moment, he didn't move, just stood there looking at me like he was trying to decide whether to give in or walk away. Then, without warning, his hand reached out, his fingers brushing against my jaw before cupping my face gently. "You're sure?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper, his thumb lightly tracing my cheek. I nodded, leaning into his touch, my heart pounding so hard I was sure he could hear it. "I've never been more sure," I whispered back. That was all it took. Ronald closed the distance between us, his lips capturing mine in a kiss that was anything but hesitant this time. It was deeper, more urgent, as if all the weeks of tension between us had finally reached a breaking point. His hand slid from my face to the back of my neck, pulling me closer, while his other hand rested on my waist, grounding me in the moment. I let myself sink into the kiss, my hands instinctively finding their way to his chest. I could feel the solid muscle beneath his shirt, the steady rhythm of his heartbeat matching my own. The intensity of it all was overwhelming in the best way, sending shivers down my spine as his lips moved against mine with a fervor that made me feel like I was the only thing that mattered to him in that moment. The cold tile wall pressed against my back as he guided me gently, his body close enough that I could feel every inch of him. The sensation sent a jolt of electricity through me, and I couldn't hold back the soft gasp that escaped my lips. His hands were everywhere, my waist, my back, my arms, like he couldn't decide where to touch me first. Each movement was deliberate, full of a tenderness that made my chest ache. And yet there was an edge to it too, a hunger that neither of us could ignore. I could feel it in the way his fingers tightened slightly on my hips, in the way his kisses deepened, each one more insistent than the last. It was as if he was trying to memorize every part of me, to leave no doubt in my mind about how much he wanted this. How much he wanted me. My hand slid up to his shoulders, gripping them tightly as I felt my knees go weak under the weight of it all. "Ronald," I breathed against his lips, my voice shaky with a mixture of anticipation and disbelief. "This feels right," he finished for me, pulling back just enough to look me in the eyes. His gaze was intense. His blue eyes darkened with emotion as he searched my face for any sign of doubt. "It feels right," I nodded, unable to find the words to respond. And he smiled, a soft, almost vulnerable smile that made my heart ache. "You're incredible," he said quietly, his fingers brushing a strand of hair away from my face before trailing down to my jawline. "I hope you know that." Before I could respond, he kissed me again, slower this time, but no less passionate. His hand slid down my sides, his touch firm but gentle, and I felt myself leaning into him, letting him guide me wherever he wanted. There was something so intoxicating about the way he touched me, the way he made me feel like nothing else in the world mattered except this moment. Eventually, we went even further, but I can't tell you every detail. Obviously, what I can tell you is that it was amazing. A bit hurtful, but amazing. And when he finished, he pulled back slightly as we both caught our breath. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice soft, his hand still resting on my hips. "Yeah," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "More than okay." His lips quirked into a small smile, and he leaned in to press a soft kiss to my temple before stepping back slightly, giving me just enough space to breathe. But the way his hands lingered on me, his fingers brushing against my skin as if he couldn't quite bring himself to let go, told me that he wasn't ready to step away completely. I could feel the heat between us, the tension that had only grown stronger with every passing second. It was like we were standing on the edge of something huge. Something that neither of us fully understood, but both of us were desperate to explore. Ronald's hands moved to my waist, his thumbs tracing slow, deliberate circles against my skin through the fabric of my shirt. "I've wanted this for so long," he admitted quietly, his voice low and raw with emotion. "But I never thought it could actually happen." "Me neither," I said, my own voice trembling with the weight of the moment. "But I'm glad it did." The words hung in the air between us, and for a moment we just stood there, our bodies close, our breaths mingling in the quiet. It felt like time had stopped, like the rest of the world had faded away, leaving only us and this strange, wonderful connection we'd found. But the sound of footsteps echoing faintly down the hall snapped us back to reality. Ronald's grip on my waist tightened slightly, and he glanced toward the door, his expression suddenly tense. "We should be careful," he said quietly, his voice tinged with regret. I nodded, though part of me didn't want this moment to end. "I know." Ronald looked back at me, his gaze softening as he reached up to brush his fingers against my cheek one last time. "This isn't over," he said, his voice firm despite the quiet urgency in his tone. "We'll figure it out together. Okay?" I said, my heart swelling at his words. He gave me a small, reassuring smile before stepping back, his hands finally leaving my waist. The loss of his touch was immediate and overwhelming, but the promise in his eyes gave me hope. As he moved toward the door, he paused, glancing back at me one last time. "Stay here for a bit," he said, his voice low. "I'll make sure the coast is clear." I nodded, watching as he slipped out the door, the sound of it clicking shut behind him echoing in the now empty space. My heart was still racing, my mind spinning with everything that had just happened. But one thing was certain: nothing would ever be the same again. The moment Ronald stepped out of the school bathroom, I was left standing alone in the quiet, my back still pressed against the cool tile wall. The air felt heavier now, charged with the lingering heat of everything that had just happened between us. My lips tingled, my skin buzzing with the memory of his touch. It was overwhelming in the best way. Like every nerve in my body had been set alight, leaving me both exhilarated and utterly unmoored. I leaned my head back against the wall, trying to steady my breathing. The distant sound of footsteps faded into silence, and for a brief moment I allowed myself to revel in the sheer intensity of what had just transpired. I could still feel Ronald's hands on me, his lips against mine, the warmth of his body pressed so close it was like he had become a part of me. The thought sent a fresh wave of heat rushing through me. But as the quiet stretched on, reality began to creep back in. What had we just done? I didn't regret it, not for a second, but the weight of it all was undeniable. This wasn't just some harmless moment of teenage impulsiveness. This was something more, something deeper, something that felt as dangerous as it did intoxicating. And now we had to figure out how to deal with it. Before I could spiral too far into my thoughts, the door creaked open again. My heart leapt into my throat, and I stood frozen, my pulse pounding in my ears as I braced myself for the worst. But it was Ronald. He slipped back inside, his gaze immediately finding mine. The tension in his shoulders eased as he shut the door behind him. And I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. "It's all clear," he said softly, his voice low and steady. "No one's around." Relief washed over me, but it was quickly replaced by the same electric pull I felt every time I was near him. He crossed the room in just a few steps, and before I could say anything, his hands were on me again, firm but gentle, grounding me in the moment. "Are you okay?" he asked, his thumb brushing lightly against my jaw as he searched my face for any signs of doubt. "Yeah," I managed, my voice catching in my throat. "More than okay." His lips quirked into a small, almost shy smile, and he leaned down to press a soft kiss to my forehead. The tenderness of the gesture made my chest ache, and I felt myself melting under his touch. "I couldn't leave," he admitted quietly, his breath warm against my skin. "Not like that, not without knowing you're okay." I looked up at him, my heart pounding as I took in the vulnerability in his expression. "I'm fine, Ronald," I said, my voice steady despite the storm of emotions swirling inside me. "But I don't want this to end." He froze for a moment, his eyes locking onto mine. "It doesn't have to," he said softly, his voice tinged with both hope and uncertainty. "But we have to be careful." I nodded, knowing he was right, but wishing it didn't have to be this complicated. "I know," I said, my hands tightening slightly on his shirt. "But I don't care about the risks. I just want you." The words hung in the air between us, and for a moment neither of us moved. Then, without warning, he kissed me again, deeper, hungrier than before. This time there was no hesitation, no second guessing. It was raw and intense, and it left me breathless, my hands tangling in his hair as I pulled him closer. His hand slid down my sides, gripping my hips as he pressed me back against the wall. The cold tile against my skin was a stark contrast to the heat of his touch, and it sent a shiver racing down my spine. I gasped softly against his lips, and he responded by deepening the kiss, his body pressing against mine with a desperation that mirrored my own. It was reckless, it was dangerous, and it was everything I had ever wanted. For what felt like an eternity, we stayed like that, lost in each other, the world outside the bathroom forgotten. His hands explored my body with a confidence that made my heart race. And I couldn't stop myself from responding in kind. Every touch, every kiss, felt like a promise, a silent agreement that whatever this was, it was real. Eventually, we broke apart, both of us breathing heavily as we stared at each other. His forehead rested against mine, his hands still on my waist as he struggled to catch his breath. "You're incredible," he murmured, his voice low and full of emotion. "So are you," I said, my own voice trembling with the weight of everything I felt in that moment. He smiled, his thumb brushing against my cheek as he leaned in to press a soft, lingering kiss to my lips. "We should go," he said reluctantly, his voice tinged with regret. "Before someone notices we're gone." I nodded, though every part of me wanted to stay in this moment forever. But I knew he was right. We couldn't stay here, no matter how much we wanted to. He stepped back, his hands falling away from me, and the loss of his touch was immediate and overwhelming. But the look in his eyes, the quiet intensity, the unspoken promise, was enough to reassure me that this wasn't the end. When we left the bathroom and stepped back into the empty hallway, I couldn't help but feel like everything had changed. The world felt brighter, sharper, like I was seeing it through new eyes. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I wasn't alone. As we walked down the empty hallway, a strange mix of emotions swirled within me: excitement, fear, and an odd sense of calm. The air was thick with everything we hadn't said, every unspoken thought lingering between us. I glanced at Ronald, his jaw set and his eyes forward, like he was deep in thought. The faint scent of his cologne still clung to my skin, grounding me in the reality of what had just happened. "Paul," he said quietly, his voice breaking the silence, "I need you to know something." I stopped walking, turning to face him. His expression was soft, but there was a weight to his words that made my chest tighten. "What is it?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He hesitated, his gaze flicking to the floor for a moment before meeting mine again. "This isn't just a fleeting thing for me. I don't know where this will go, or how we'll navigate it. But I care about you more than I probably should." My breath caught in my throat. Hearing him say it out loud, acknowledging what I had felt so deeply, sent a rush of warmth through me. "I care about you too," I said, my words coming out steadier than I expected. "And I don't want this to be a one-time thing." A small smile tugged at the corners of his lips, and he reached out, his fingers brushing lightly against mine. It was a simple gesture, but it spoke volumes, a silent promise that we were in this together. No matter how complicated it might be, we'll figure it out, he said softly, his voice carrying a certainty that made me believe him. "But for now, let's take it one step at a time. No rushing, no expectations. Just us." I nodded, my chest swelling with a mix of hope and gratitude. "I can do that." As we resumed walking, the tension in the air slowly began to ease, replaced by a quiet understanding. When we reached the school's side exit, Ronald paused, glancing around to make sure the coast was clear. The fading sunlight cast long shadows across the pavement. And for a moment, the world felt impossibly still. "I'll see you tomorrow," he said, his voice warm but cautious. "But if you ever need to talk, or anything, you know where to find me." I nodded, a soft smile spreading across my lips. "Thanks, Ronald, for everything." He gave me one last lingering look. His eyes filled with a mix of emotions I couldn't quite decipher. Then, with a quick glance over his shoulder, he slipped out the door and into the fading light, leaving me standing alone in the empty hallway. For a moment, I just stood there, replaying everything in my mind, the way he had looked at me, the way his touch had set my skin on fire, the way he had made me feel like I was the only person in the world who mattered. And as I turned to leave, a small but certain thought settled in my mind. This wasn't the end. It was only the beginning.